April 8, 1943, northern France. 11:47 p.m. Inside a dimly lit concrete bunker near the town of Le Tréport, a young radar operator rubbed his eyes and leaned in closer to the phosphorescent green screen in front of him. The hum of the radar equipment echoed off the damp walls. It was routine by now. Blips would appear, course headings would be called out, and German interceptors would rise to meet whatever dared cross the western sky. But tonight, something was different. The screen pulsed, again and again, and then showed something he had never seen before. A cluster of returns moving too fast and flying too high. The signal intensity suggested size, massive size. At first, he thought it was a malfunction. He adjusted the calibration knobs, tapped the casing, recalibrated the sweep, but the echoes remained. Dozens of them, heading east, moving with a kind of mechanical confidence that sent a chill down his spine. He turned to his commanding officer. "Sir, you need to see this." The officer leaned over. For a moment, silence overtook the room. Then he stepped back, confused and pale. "They're not supposed to come at night," he muttered. "And not this many." The air inside the bunker felt thicker. The operators, who moments ago had been yawning or sipping ersatz coffee, were now standing straight, scanning equipment with precision. Some exchanged nervous glances. One quietly crossed himself. The Luftwaffe had radar superiority. At least, they thought they did. Since 1940, German radar stations along the Atlantic Wall had been the first line of defense against Allied bombers. They gave early warning. They gave time. And for 3 years, that had been enough. But this was something else. As the signals advanced, there was a growing sense of disbelief. It was too fast for heavy bombers, too consistent for decoys, too bold for anything the Americans had sent before. The West had always brought something, but never this organized, never this big. Outside the bunker, the sky was pitch black, but high above, at over 25,000 feet, the night was broken by the low rumble of engines. Not a whine, not a scream. This was a rolling, resonant growl that felt less like sound and more like prophecy. Across northern France, radar stations began reporting similar signals. They were coming in waves, tight formations. Command centers were alerted. Fighters scrambled. But many officers hesitated. They assumed it was a mistake, a glitch, perhaps a radar ghost, an atmospheric echo. Because if it was real, then the Luftwaffe was no longer in control. The German high command had grown used to being the hunters. They had dictated the tempo of aerial warfare since the invasion of Poland. Even in the defense of the Reich, they believed their pilots were simply better, more experienced, more lethal. But radar doesn't lie. What they were detecting was the arrival of something engineered, not just to win battles, but to end the entire concept of German air superiority. What the radar saw that night was the first industrial shadow of a storm that would sweep across Europe with relentless precision. And as the screens glowed and the signals grew stronger, the officers in those dark bunkers felt something unfamiliar creeping in. Not confusion, not irritation, fear. Because while the Reich believed in ace pilots and tactical genius, this was the sound of mass production. The radar didn't pick up individuals. It picked up systems, machines. Dozens of aircraft moving as one, protected, linked, calculated. There was no randomness in the pattern, no gaps, no hesitation, just the cold logic of overwhelming force. This wasn't the Luftwaffe's war anymore. It was the beginning of a new kind of warfare, one where the outcome would be decided not by skill alone, but by who could build faster, fly farther, and replace what was lost in days, not months. One young operator, barely 20, whispered under his breath in disbelief. "Keep coming!" He wasn't wrong. From high above the clouds, the American formation pierced through the night like steel migrating eastward. Each plane, a piece of a machine far larger than itself. Behind the roar of engines lay the factories of Michigan, the drafting tables of Lockheed and Republic, the industrial heart of a nation that had finally shifted into full gear. The sky no longer belonged to men. It belonged to assembly lines. This was the night Germany realized it was no longer fighting an enemy. It was fighting an economy. And while the first anti-air batteries opened fire and squadrons scrambled into the darkness, one truth had already become clear. to those staring into glowing radar screens. What was coming couldn't be stopped, not with experience, not with courage, and not with the tactics of a war that had already passed into memory. In the spring of 1943, German fighter aces walked with a swagger. They had earned it. With thousands of missions under their belts, many had fought in Spain, Poland, France, and Britain. They weren't just soldiers. They were symbols of the Reich's dominance in the skies. Names like Galland, Marseille, and Hartmann were whispered with awe. Some wore their knight's crosses with quiet pride, others with boastful arrogance. But all of them shared one belief, carved into their routines like a prayer, that the sky belonged to them. To the Luftwaffe, American planes were a joke. They called them milk bottles, fat, slow, white-bellied bombers waddling across the channel. Easy prey for the sleek, agile Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s. Even the early escort fighters, like the P-40 Warhawk, were dismissed as outdated. Poor turning performance, sluggish climb rates, and short range meant they were rarely a threat once the real fight began over occupied France or the Ruhr. German pilots often spoke about the Americans the way a lion might speak of sheep. Brave, perhaps, but predictable. Naive, green. They flew formations, in tight, relied on gunners, and panicked when those formations were broken. Luftwaffe squadrons developed tactics specifically to disrupt these defensive boxes. A high-speed dive from the sun, a slashing attack from below, pull out, reposition, repeat. The Americans in those days died by the dozens, and the Germans laughed. There is a famous anecdote from a Luftwaffe mess hall in late 1942. A pilot pinned a crude drawing to the wall. It showed a B-17 with a blindfold, being led by a P-38 with a cane. Underneath, in clumsy English, it read, "American Escort System." The room reportedly erupted with laughter. It was more than arrogance. It was confidence born from experience. The German Air Force had been designed around the principle of tactical dominance, short-range fighters, quick strikes, ground support. They didn't build for long wars, they built for swift victories. And early in the war, that design philosophy seemed infallible. From Warsaw to Paris, the Luftwaffe had been unstoppable. So when the Americans arrived, they brought with them not just new aircraft, but a new rhythm, one the Germans didn't understand and didn't fear. Yet, at American air bases in England, bomber crews were still figuring things out. Planes went down due to weather, mechanical failures, and navigational errors as often as enemy fire. Mid-air collisions during formation takeoff were common. Gunners sometimes froze in place from fear or the cold. Pilots had trouble keeping formation at high altitude. Ground crews worked frantically to solve engine reliability issues. The entire American air effort felt experimental. German pilots knew this. They intercepted radio chatter. They watched as missions failed or turned back. They studied the formations, mapped the weaknesses, and sharpened their claws. Veterans boasted about bringing down 3 or 4 fortresses in a single mission. Some returned to base with kill counts higher than entire American squadrons. But hidden in this theater of superiority was a blindness, a fatal miscalculation. The Germans viewed the Americans as if they were just another version of the British, a little louder, a little younger, but flying with the same strategy. What they failed to see was that America wasn't fighting the same war. They were learning, rapidly, and they had something the Luftwaffe didn't: time and numbers. While the Germans celebrated each tactical victory, the Americans quietly built airfields, thousands of them. They filled hangars with new aircraft, trained waves of new pilots, and replaced losses with terrifying speed. A downed pilot in the Luftwaffe meant one less veteran. A downed pilot in the USAAF meant one more lesson for the next 10 in line. There was no sentimentality in the American approach. There was process, analysis, adaptation. Mistakes were data. And every failed mission returned home not in shame, but as fuel for the next improvement. In Germany, replacements were scarce. The training program couldn't keep up. Fuel shortages began to affect flight hours. Simulators were few. By 1943, some rookie pilots were being rushed to the front with less than 100 hours of total flight time. And while they were being thrown into the deep end, the Americans were standardizing procedures, improving oxygen systems, inventing heated flight suits, and redesigning bomber turrets. But none of this was visible to the Germans, not yet. All they saw were formations, fat targets. Their victories continued. For now, there's a haunting moment recorded in the diary of a Luftwaffe officer stationed near Lille in May 1943. After watching another wave of B-17s get shredded by interceptors, he wrote, "They came in stupidly again, as if they thought courage was armor. They must be mad, or they know something we don't." That line, "they know something we don't," would come to define the months that followed. Because behind every crude joke, every mocking cartoon, every cheer in the officers' mess, there was a creeping question none of them could answer. Why do they keep coming? Why do they return again and again in daylight, over our cities, through our defenses, in formation, despite everything we throw at them? The answer, though not yet clear, was already unfolding. It was not bravery, it was design. And if you've enjoyed the depth of this story so far, let your voice be part of it. Share your thoughts in the comments and join the mission by subscribing to the channel. Every story shared keeps history alive. At first, they thought it was a trick. When German spotters saw the bomber formations coming over the coast, they reached for their phones, their radios, their binoculars. The heavy shadows in the sky were familiar now. Dozens of silver B-17s flying in staggered boxes, reflecting the morning sun like a floating city of steel. The sight had become routine, predictable. Intercept, climb, attack, return. But on this morning, something looked wrong. The shapes beside the bombers were not what they expected. Fighters, dozens of them, but not British, and not turning back early. For months, the Luftwaffe had relied on a simple fact. American escort fighters could not go the distance. Their fuel tanks were too small. They turned back before the bombers reached their targets. This created a deadly gap. Somewhere over Belgium or Western Germany, the bombers would be exposed, vulnerable, unsupported. It was there that the Germans struck. But now, that gap was gone. They first appeared as flashes of movement in the upper flanks of the bomber formations. Fast, heavier than Spitfires, with wings like stubby knives and a profile that made them look like flying anvils. As the German fighters closed in for their usual attack runs, these new shapes peeled off from the bombers and climbed to meet them, head on. No hesitation. This was not a typical fighter. It looked too big. It sounded wrong. Instead of a high-pitched whine, it growled, a deep, mechanical roar that echoed through the sky like something primal. It was the P-47 Thunderbolt. To the Germans, it didn't make sense. Fighters were supposed to be light, agile, nimble. But this thing? It looked like it had been welded together in a factory that built locomotives. It was huge, almost absurdly so. Some pilots joked it looked like two airplanes stacked on top of each other, but it wasn't the size that shook them. It was what came next. During the first real encounters, Luftwaffe pilots reported diving on bomber formations as usual. But then the Thunderbolts came. Not chasing, not flanking. They attacked from above, from behind, from head-on, and they did not run. In one mission over the Ruhr Valley, a German pilot made 3 passes at a formation of B-17s, each time dodging return fire and banking hard to reposition. On his 4th run, he spotted a single aircraft tailing him. At first, he ignored it. Then, the .50 caliber tracers began to streak past his canopy. He pulled hard into a dive, expecting to lose his pursuer easily. He didn't. The Thunderbolt followed him down. That was when everything changed. Because this American fighter could dive faster than anything the Germans had. It used gravity like a weapon. Its airframe, built for strength over finesse, could handle speeds that tore wings off lighter aircraft. And when it fired, it didn't nibble. It hammered. 8 Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing. When they opened up, it sounded less like gunfire and more like ripping cloth amplified through a megaphone. A single burst could shred a fuselage. A second could vaporize it. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't beautiful, but it was effective. Many Luftwaffe pilots made the same mistake. They assumed they could outturn the P-47. They couldn't. They assumed it was too heavy to fight at altitude. It wasn't. They assumed, fatally, that it would not follow them home. It did. Reports began circulating across German squadrons. Some called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut. Others simply referred to it as the Brute. Whatever the name, one fact became impossible to ignore. This was not a plane. It was a declaration. Because the Thunderbolt did not just defend bombers. It hunted defenders. Its range was extended through drop tanks. Its high-altitude performance was unmatched, and its presence changed the psychology of the mission. American bomber crews began to feel something they had not felt in months: hope. They watched through plexiglass nose cones as thunderbolts tore into enemy fighters. They cheered as the bulky shapes danced in lethal arcs above them. No longer sitting ducks, they flew with guardians. And the Germans noticed. An intelligence report from late 1943 stated simply, "New enemy fighter encountered. Heavy armor, heavy firepower, high-speed dive performance superior. Avoid vertical engagement. In other words, run." But many didn't get the chance, because for every German pilot who saw the Thunderbolt and escaped, another never made it back to base. Shot down by a machine they didn't understand. A machine that shouldn't be able to do what it did. A machine that bent every assumption the Luftwaffe held about air combat. The skies were changing. The shadows had grown teeth. And what began as a strange shape on the radar had now become a nightmare in the daylight. And if you're finding yourself pulled into this forgotten corner of history, don't hold back. Share your thoughts below and let us know. What part of this surprised you the most? And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button and stand with us as we uncover the stories the sky tried to bury. It looked like it should not fly. The P-47 Thunderbolt was unlike anything the European theater had seen. Weighing over 7 tons when fully loaded, it was the heaviest single-engine fighter of World War II. Its profile was intimidating even on the ground. A massive radial engine at the nose, a wide fuselage shaped like a barrel, and stubby wings that seemed too small to lift it into the air. Compared to the sleek silhouettes of German fighters, it resembled a flying brute, and that was exactly what it was. Underneath that rounded armor was one of the most powerful piston engines ever installed on a fighter, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower. A monster of a power plant that could propel the Thunderbolt at over 430 miles per hour and send it diving through the sky like a falling anvil. But it was not just about speed. It was about survival. This engine was protected by a massive cowling and air-cooled design, making it far more resistant to damage than the liquid-cooled engines found in aircraft like the German Messerschmitt Bf 109 or British Spitfire. A single bullet through a radiator could bring those planes down, but the P-47 could take hit after hit and keep going. Pilots joked that it was easier to damage the planet than to destroy a Thunderbolt, and the armor was no joke. Its cockpit was surrounded by a bathtub of steel plates. Its thick skin could absorb 20mm cannon fire. German pilots learned quickly that unless they hit a P-47 just right, it was coming home. And it might be coming for them. The firepower it carried was nothing short of devastating. 4 Browning 50 caliber machine guns in each wing gave the Thunderbolt a total of 8. That meant roughly 100 rounds per second when fired simultaneously. Each bullet could punch through engine blocks, shatter wings, or rip a fuselage apart. And when it strafed ground targets, it left trails of fire and torn earth in its wake. It wasn't just a fighter. It was a warhammer with wings. American pilots fell in love with it for one reason above all. It brought them home. Time and again, aircraft returned to base riddled with holes, entire chunks missing from wings and fuselage. But the engine still ran. The frame held, and the pilot lived. Stories spread fast across airfields in England and France. One pilot took a direct hit to the engine cowling. Flames licked the glass of the cockpit. He shut off the fuel line, dove to douse the fire, and limped back to base with oil pouring from the engine and half the instruments dead. The crew chief counted over 180 bullet holes. The pilot walked away unscathed. Another came back with an entire elevator missing. Another had the landing gear shot off mid-flight and still managed to belly land. In squadron after squadron, the myth of the Thunderbolt grew. But it was not myth, it was engineering. Republic Aviation, the company behind the P-47, had designed it from the start as a high-altitude interceptor. But war had other plans. The aircraft was quickly adapted into a multi-role monster. It climbed with grace thanks to a turbo supercharger tucked deep in its belly, giving it breath even at 30,000 feet. It dove with such speed that German pilots hesitated to follow, and it could carry bombs, rockets, or external fuel tanks, turning it into a flexible weapon, unlike any other. But its true strength was not in any single feature. It was in how all those features came together. It could fly fast, but it could also fly high. It could hit hard, but it could also take hits. It could escort bombers deep into enemy territory. And then, on the way back, it could strafe trains, destroy convoys, or blow up fuel depots. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe began to understand that the Thunderbolt was not just a better machine. It was a different kind of machine. A machine built for a different kind of war. Where German aircraft were built to win battles, American aircraft were built to win campaigns. There was a subtle shift happening in the air. The Germans, with all their tactical brilliance, were beginning to feel the pressure of a force they couldn't outfly or outgun. Because the Thunderbolt was not just a fighter. It was the tip of a spear forged in factories, sharpened by logistics, and hurled by a nation that had barely begun to flex its industrial muscle. And still, it was only the beginning. If you felt that engine roar in your chest while hearing this story, let your thoughts echo in the comments. Share your impressions and help us keep the stories of these machines and their pilots alive. And if you haven't joined the squadron yet, hit that subscribe button and fly with us through the chapters of history that deserve to be remembered. When the Thunderbolt first entered combat, it did not just bring a new plane to the war. It brought a new doctrine, a new rhythm, a new psychology of air combat. And in that shift, something fundamental began to break inside the Luftwaffe. For years, the Germans had defined air superiority through maneuverability and instinct. Their pilots were trained in the art of the duel. Speed in a straight line meant little to them. What mattered was turn rate, positioning, and who could outsmart the other in the ballet of spirals and loops. They were fencers in the sky, elegant and deadly, and, for a time, their philosophy ruled the air. But the Thunderbolt was not interested in fencing. It fought like a hammer. The P-47 introduced a tactic the Germans had underestimated until it was too late. It was called boom and zoom, a fast dive from altitude, a short burst of devastating firepower, and a steep climb away before the enemy could even react. No turning, no dogfight, no second chances. If the hit missed, the Thunderbolt simply climbed again, reset the altitude advantage, and came back, down like judgment itself. German fighters that tried to follow were dragged into vertical fights they could not win. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, for all its grace, lost energy too quickly. The Focke-Wulf 190, sturdier, still lacked the altitude performance to keep up. Against the Thunderbolt, the very structure of Luftwaffe air combat began to unravel. Pilots who once trained for graceful duels now found themselves caught in one-sided ambushes. And it was not just the aircraft that delivered the YPV shock. It was the tempo. In a single mission over the Ardennes, a squadron of Thunderbolts diving from 20,000 feet broke apart an entire wave of German interceptors in less than 4 minutes. The Luftwaffe formation never even got close to the bombers. Radios were filled with shouts, evasive turns, and then silence. Again and again, this scene played out across the skies of Europe. But the most jarring shift was not in tactics. It was in perception. Because Luftwaffe pilots, once the apex, predators of the sky, started flying with hesitation. They checked their six more often. They climbed with caution. They attacked only when sure the Thunderbolts were not nearby. This was new. This was fear. One German ace, credited with over 40 kills, wrote in a letter home, "The big American fighters now haunt our attacks. They fall from the sky like rocks, spit fire, and vanish before we can breathe. We no longer fight them. We avoid them." And avoid them, they tried. But Thunderbolts came in numbers, and they flew with impunity. With their long-range drop tanks, They escorted bombers deeper into German territory. With each mile, they changed the dynamic. No longer were Allied bombers on borrowed time once their escorts turned back. Now, they were guarded to the target and back. And the Luftwaffe, once masters of timing their strikes during the escort gap, found no more gaps to exploit. It was not a war of numbers alone. It was a war of endurance, a war of energy. The Thunderbolt climb to altitude, strike, and climb again. It was a rhythm, predictable, relentless, terrifying, and that rhythm bled into everything. German squadron leaders began altering flight plans. Interceptor groups broke apart more frequently under pressure. Orders came down to avoid engagement if Thunderbolts were present in large numbers. These changes, subtle at first, snowballed into operational chaos. Morale dipped, fatigue set in, and for the first time, German pilots were asking questions they had never dared before. Why are we losing? The answer was not in tactics. It was in design. The Thunderbolt was not built to duel. It was built to win, to absorb punishment, and deliver more in return. To outclimb, outdive, outrun. And it did. Even more devastating than its guns or armor was the message it sent with every successful mission. You are no longer the hunters. That psychological reversal was devastating. German pilots trained from their first flight to think of the enemy as prey. But now, it was they who scattered when the Thunderbolt arrived. Reports from late 1943 showed a noticeable decrease in effective German interceptions over Western Europe. Entire bomber groups made it through raids untouched by fighters. The Luftwaffe's reach was shrinking, not because of fuel or planes, but because the skies were no longer theirs. Every time a Thunderbolt dove into a fight and climbed away untouched, it chipped at the myth of German superiority. Every time a bomber, formation returned with minimal losses. The balance of power shifted further. And deep inside Luftwaffe command rooms, officers began to realize something even more alarming. The Americans were just getting started. If this chapter left you with that uneasy silence that only history can bring, I invite you to share what you felt. Drop your thoughts in the comments and keep this memory alive. And if you believe more people should hear stories like this one, subscribe and help us honor the sky's forgotten battles. The sky above France on June 26, 1943, was not quiet. It roared with the thunder of engines, the staccato chatter of machine guns, and the radio static of men fighting for their lives at 25,000 feet. Somewhere in that chaos, flying his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, was Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron. What happened to him that day would become legend, not because he executed a brilliant maneuver or downed a dozen planes, but because he should have died, and didn't. The mission had started like many others. Escort duty. A swarm of B-17s headed deep into German-controlled territory, with Thunderbolts circling and weaving like watchful dogs. At altitude, the formation looked like a moving fortress of steel and firepower. But even fortresses have blind spots. And that morning, the Luftwaffe found them. Johnson's Thunderbolt was hit without warning. A German fighter, likely a Focke-Wulf 190, opened up from behind. Tracer rounds ripped through his fuselage. One smashed into the canopy, exploding into shards that embedded in his face and shoulders. Another round shattered the control panel. A shell exploded near the radio. The cockpit filled with smoke and hydraulic fluid. He was blind, bleeding, and barely conscious. The aircraft bucked and shook. Johnson reached for the controls, but they were sluggish, unresponsive. His flight stick moved, but the plane answered with a groan, not a turn. He was flying, a crippled wreck, but he was still flying. And then, through the haze and blood in his eyes, he saw the enemy return. A lone German fighter pulled alongside his broken Thunderbolt, close, so close that Johnson could see the pilot's helmet, the tilt of his head, the way he studied the ruined American plane. The German had every reason to finish the job. Johnson was helpless. The Thunderbolt could barely keep altitude. A few more bullets would have sealed his fate, but the German didn't fire. Instead, he circled, watched, and then, incredibly, he lined up again. Not for a clean kill, but to rake the Thunderbolt from nose to tail. Bullets stitched across the fuselage. Smoke poured from the engine. Still, the aircraft held. A second pass. More rounds. More impact. Yet the Thunderbolt refused to fall. By the third pass, the German pilot must have begun to feel something strange. Not fear, not frustration, but disbelief. The American fighter, shredded and trailing smoke, would not die. After the fourth pass, the German pulled up alongside Johnson again, slowed his speed, tilted his wings, and saluted. Then he turned and flew away. Johnson's plane, riddled with more than 200 bullet holes, somehow limped back to England. His canopy was shattered, the cockpit soaked in blood. He had nearly lost consciousness multiple times, but he landed and walked away. The ground crew stared in silence at the state of the aircraft. The wings looked like lace. Parts of the control surface were missing entirely. When they opened the free engine cowling, they found it riddled with fragments, and yet it had brought its pilot home. In the aftermath, Johnson received the Distinguished Service Cross. But even greater than the medal was the effect his story had on morale, because it proved something critical. The P-47 was not just fast, it was not just powerful, it was durable in a way that defied reason. Pilots began to believe that no matter how bad things got, their plane would bring them back. And belief in a machine, especially in the hell of air combat, is a weapon all its own. German pilots, too, began to whisper about it. The American fighter that could not be shot down. The flying tank. The beast that took fire and refused to fall. Stories like Johnson's spread faster than orders. They were told in mess halls, written in letters, recounted during late-night maintenance checks. One man, one plane, 200 holes, and a salute from an enemy who, in that moment, had seen something greater than steel. He had seen will. This moment revealed a deeper truth the Luftwaffe could not yet grasp, that behind the American machines was a culture of persistence, a refusal to break, even when blood covered the cockpit and fire filled the engine. And in that cockpit, on that day, Robert Johnson was not just a pilot. He was the embodiment of something far more dangerous than a well-built aircraft. He was a symbol of a system that was learning, adapting, and returning stronger after every blow. And if this story caught you off guard, made you pause, made you feel something, take a second to share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in the place of that German pilot? And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing. These stories are more than history. They are echoes of something we must never forget. By 1944, it was no longer a war of aces. It was a war of factories. The Luftwaffe, forged in the crucible of blitzkrieg, had been built for lightning strikes, short campaigns, and surgical victories. Its aircraft were excellent. Its pilots were skilled. But it had never been designed to fight an enemy with 1,000 engines for every one of its own. It had never planned for a war that would be fought not just in the skies, but in the assembly lines of Detroit, Buffalo, and Tulsa. The United States had entered the war slowly, but when it moved like an avalanche. By 1944, the arsenal of democracy was producing more than just planes. It was producing inevitability. Republic Aviation, the company behind the P-47, had once been a modest manufacturer. By mid-war, they had transformed their Farmingdale plant into a continuous machine of motion. At its peak, a new P-47 rolled out every 30 minutes. Every half hour, a new beast of steel and fire was wheeled toward the runway. Engines tested, instruments checked, and then shipped across the Atlantic to be flown into battle. In Germany, this was unthinkable. By that point, German factories were under constant attack. Raw materials were scarce. Skilled labor was dying at the front. Fuel was rationed. Engineers worked by candlelight in some facilities, and still, they tried to keep up. But every time they launched a new squadron of fighters, the Americans already had 10 more waiting in crates. In 1944 alone, the United States produced over 15,000 Thunderbolts. The German aircraft that faced them were technical masterpieces. The Focke-Wulf 190, the Me-109, and later, even jets like the Me-262. But there were never enough. The Luftwaffe's brilliance was tactical. The American advantage was strategic. Factories in Illinois, Ohio, and California were not just assembling planes. They were assembling systems, logistics, redundancy, training pipelines, maintenance protocols. Everything the Luftwaffe had once done better, the Americans now did in volume. For every Thunderbolt destroyed, another was already on its way. Pilots who were shot down and survived were often flying again within weeks. Ground crews rotated through shifts, replacing engines and fixing damage with a speed that seemed mechanical in itself. Squadrons expanded, bases multiplied. The air war was no longer one of survival. It was one of pressure, and pressure breaks steel. It wasn't just the numbers that overwhelmed the Luftwaffe, it was the tempo. German fighter groups had to choose between defense and retreat. The Americans gave them neither. With each raid, the bombers flew farther. The Thunderbolts stayed longer, and the destruction deepened. Rail lines, bridges, ammunition dumps, aircraft factories, fuel depots. They weren't just targets, they were arteries, and the P-47, with its heavy load capacity, was perfectly suited to sever them. It could carry up to 2,500 pounds of bombs. It could fire rockets. It could dive and strafe and climb again. And with each sortie, the industrial lifeblood of the Reich ran thinner. The Thunderbolt had begun as an escort fighter, but by 1944, it had evolved into a full-scale tactical weapon. And the scale was staggering. At one point, during the Normandy campaign, Thunderbolts were flying over 500 sorties per day. They devastated convoys, flattened artillery positions, and rained destruction on retreating German forces. Their presence was constant, unrelenting, deafening. In field reports, German soldiers began calling the P-47 der Fliegende Panzer, the flying tank. Some believed it was invincible. Others swore they had seen bullets bounce off its wings. Wehrmacht corporal wrote in his journal, "They scream from the clouds, fall like fire, and vanish. They are not aircraft, they are storms." And still, the factories in America kept producing. The cost to the United States was enormous. Thousands of airmen lost, planes destroyed, supplies consumed, but every cost was absorbed, replaced, and recycled into a machine that did not stop. The Luftwaffe, once feared across the continent, was being undone not by a single battle, but by an enemy that could afford to lose and still win. Because for every German pilot with 50 kills, there were now 500 Americans ready to fly the next mission. For every downed Thunderbolt, another tax-funded monster took its place. And in the end, numbers mattered. A pilot once said, "The Germans fly like knights. We fly like carpenters." But in the end, it's not the sword that wins the war, it's the hammer. And the Thunderbolt was the hammer. If this chapter gave you a new sense of what industrial power really means in war, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Share what struck you most in the comments. And if you feel like helping others discover these forgotten stories, hit that subscribe button. Your voice helps history stay alive. At the beginning of the war, the P-47 Thunderbolt was created to defend. It was born as a bodyguard for bombers, an aerial shield to protect the lumbering B-17s from German interceptors. But, as 1944 unfolded and the Allies pushed deeper into occupied Europe, the Thunderbolt began to evolve. It was no longer just a protector. It became something else, a predator. The turning point came when American commanders realized that air superiority was not enough. It was no longer sufficient to survive missions and escort bombers to their targets. The time had come to dominate, to seek, to strike, and to deny the Luftwaffe even the possibility of combat. The Thunderbolt was perfectly suited for this shift in strategy. With its incredible speed in a dive, its heavy armament, and its nearly indestructible frame, it was no longer just a guardian. It became a hammer that roamed the skies in search of something to break. The tactic was simple. Instead of waiting for German fighters to attack, P-47s began to fly aggressive sweeps ahead of the bomber formations. They were unleashed with a single purpose: to find and destroy. Luftwaffe bases, hangars, train yards, fuel convoys, and radar stations became daily targets. Even enemy fighters parked on the tarmac were hunted like prey, and the Germans started to feel it. A base in Saint-Dizier was struck 3 times in 1 week by low-flying Thunderbolts. Fuel depots near Reims were wiped out in broad daylight. In some cases, P-47s would strafe enemy columns just to provoke return fire, then climb and destroy the positions from above. It was war on the offensive, psychological and relentless. In the days following D-Day, This shift became even more visible. As Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Punts, Thunderbolts created a curtain of fire in the sky. They flew low, strafing roads and intersections to block German reinforcements. They dove onto panzer divisions moving through hedgerows. They obliterated artillery nests before the shells could reach the beaches. Each P-47 now carried more than just machine guns. They were loaded with rockets, 500-pound bombs, or napalm canisters. They operated from hastily built airfields, some just miles from the front line. They flew in pairs, in fours, in swarms. One Wehrmacht officer wrote, "There is no sky above us, only fire." Thunderbolts earned a new reputation in these months. Ground troops began calling them Jabos, short for Jagdbomber, fighter bombers. And the German soldiers who feared them had good reason. A single Thunderbolt could level a truck column. A flight of 4 could stop a battalion from moving for an entire day. But it wasn't only the destruction they left behind that made them terrifying. It was the suddenness. German units reported that the P-47 seemed to come from nowhere. A low whine in the distance, then thunder, then fire, then silence. This ability to hit fast and vanish made them ideal for a new style of warfare, the fighter sweep. Thunderbolts would now take off not tied to bombers, but in autonomous groups, ranging deep into German territory. Their job was to stir the hornet's nest, to goad enemy fighters into the sky, and then tear them apart before they could even climb to altitude. Some missions reported entire squadrons of German aircraft caught just after takeoff. Others targeted trains. The P-47 was so stable in a dive that it could drop a bomb or fire rockets with deadly precision while descending almost vertically. Its presence in the sky began to shape ground movement. German commanders altered convoy routes. They moved at night. They spaced vehicles farther apart. But it made no difference. The Thunderbolt hunted by sound, by shadow, by habit. It had become a predator of rhythm. Perhaps the most symbolic transformation happened not in the air, but in the minds of those on the ground. To German troops, the sound of the P-47 was no longer just another engine. It became a warning, a high-pitch whine that deepened into a roar that shook windows before it shook the earth. And when the dust settled, there was no challenge, no response, only the smoldering remains of what had been there a moment before. This new phase of the Thunderbolt's mission blurred the lines between fighter, bomber, and terror weapon. It wasn't designed to inspire fear, but fear became its fuel. The more it struck, the more space it cleared for the advancing Allies, and the more it cleared, the less the Luftwaffe could do to stop the inevitable. Because while the Germans were still recovering from yesterday's attack, the next wave was already airborne. And when that wave finished, another was rolling down the runway. In the eyes of many German commanders, the Thunderbolt became less an aircraft and more a symbol, a sign that the skies no longer answered to them, a sign that their homeland, once so distant from the front, was now the front. And if this vision of dominance from above made you reflect on the power of persistence, let us know how it struck you in the comments. Each story is a piece of memory preserved, and your voice helps keep it alive. Tap subscribe if you want to stand with us as we continue uncovering the echoes of a war told one engine at a time. By the end of 1944, the skies over Europe no longer held suspense. They held certainty. What had once been a theater of maneuver, of ambush and reaction, had become a one-sided hunt. For the Luftwaffe, the air war had transitioned from battle to survival, and then from survival to inevitability. Their squadrons were a fraction of what they had been. Their pilots were younger, less trained, more desperate. Their fuel tanks ran dry more often than their guns, and above all, they no longer believed. There is a silence that falls over defeated men before the final blow, and it began to fall across the German radar stations in the west. The operators who once snapped to attention at the sound of approaching engines now sat still, eyes tired, hearts already resigned. They still watched their glowing screens, still listened to the static and clicks, still called out the bearings, but no one scrambled, no one intercepted, because they knew what was coming. The signals were unmistakable, the formations precise. No longer did they appear disorganized or erratic. They came in waves, in patterns, like a machine had planned it down to the second. The Americans were not launching missions anymore. They were conducting operations, orchestrated, scheduled, calculated. What had begun as resistance in the sky had been smothered by method. German pilots who managed to take off were often met by swarms of P-47s before they even reached altitude. Some died without ever seeing the enemy. Others never made it off the runway, and those who did make it home often landed on broken airfields, their comrades already gone, their fuel trucks destroyed, their commanders buried in cratered command posts. A former Luftwaffe officer, writing in exile after the war, described it best. It was not that we stopped fighting. It was that the air had turned against us. The sky belonged to them now, and we were only passing through it. This was not just a loss of machines. It was a loss of faith. The great aces, the reserves were depleted, and while the Reich still held propaganda broadcasts and speeches promising new weapons, new victories, the men in the bunkers and on the runways knew the truth. The war was already lost in the sky. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once an unproven giant, had become the soundtrack of that loss. Its engines roared not with fury, but with finality. It did not fly for glory. It flew for closure. It was the weapon of a nation that had decided not to win battles, but to end wars. And as the Allies pushed deeper into the heart of Germany, the Thunderbolts followed, escorting bombers into Berlin, strafing supply lines in Bavaria, smashing resistance on the ground, and vaporizing the last pockets of air power in the sky. It became the ever-present shadow in German memory. The shape they saw before the explosions, the sound that meant no reinforcements were coming, the fire that came from above, day after day, without pause. By May 1945, the war was nearly over. There were no German pilots left to laugh. The bunkers fell silent. The skies opened up, and the thunder had spoken. Thank you for being with us through this forgotten chapter of the war. If this story moved you, if it gave you perspective, if it made you feel something real, we ask you to share your voice. Leave a comment below and tell us what part stayed with you. And if you want to keep discovering the echoes of history, click subscribe and follow us to the next story. There's more waiting on the other side. A new video is about to appear on your screen. When it does, click it, because history does not stop, and neither do we.